We're going to start with the view from our own federal government. Dr. Laura Pettish is an ecosystem science advisor at NOAA's Climate Program Office, and she has been intensely involved with several initiatives, including the Interagency Climate Change Adaptation Task Force. Did you all know we had one? We did. We did, and she's going to tell us a little bit about that and the interactions of that with the National Ocean Policy. I don't know how much Laura may have revised or rethought her talk following the results of the election, but we're delighted to have you here, and she's going to talk about the emerging landscape of climate adaptation initiatives at the federal and national level. And it's a really great setup for our follow-on panel, which is going to be very local, our Northeast case study panel. So we'll go from federal to local, then we're going to take a break, and we're going to go international and talk about the Arctic. So I give you Dr. Laura Pettish.
Well, thanks so much, Susan, and thanks to all of you for coming back from lunch on time. So I'm going to try to do a broad brush over some of the major efforts that are underway at the federal level, particularly with respect to climate change adaptation. And it's going to have a little bit of a flavor on coasts and oceans, since that's the theme of your conference. But some of these efforts are actually even broader than that. So Dr. Guinness actually set this up nicely because he showed the same data in a slightly different format. But this is a figure from NOAA showing last year's extreme events, basically where they were located, what they were. And as he pointed out, this was a record. We had 14 individual events that each totaled more than $1 billion in damages. And the total damages were about $55 billion. And we're seeing no different this year. Basically, this is just for October. Here were the significant extreme events as documented by NOAA. And again, it's important to mention that no single extreme event can be attributed to climate change. But in general, it's projected that we'll have more extreme events and more intense extreme events in the future. And so last year, total $55 billion in damages. With Sandy alone, we might get close to that. So I wouldn't be surprised if this year we break last year's record. And we've heard a lot about Sandy already today, but I think that Sandy was a little bit of a wake-up call in reminding Americans that we may not be as resilient as we think we are to weather and climate. And these are just some images from NOAA's National Geodetic Survey showing pre- and post-Sandy conditions at the Seaside Heights, New Jersey boardwalk area. And NOAA was very involved in Hurricane Sandy, particularly in providing early warning through our National Hurricane Center and National Weather Service, and will also, is involved in longer-term conversations about extreme weather and climate. And I think it's important to note, some other speakers have noted this today, that it's not just climate change operating in a vacuum. It's the fact that we are actually behaviorally making ourselves more vulnerable. So this is an image from the 2009 U.S. National Climate Assessment showing changes in population from 1970 to 2008. The areas in blue are areas that are losing population, and the areas in pink, orange, and red are those that are gaining population. And basically, we're moving to the coasts and we're moving to the desert, which is not particularly smart from an adaptation standpoint. And so again, this is potentially going to exacerbate economic losses as we put more assets in harm's way. So I think a lot of people have different opinions on the role of the federal government in climate change. And so this is just a list of some of the common things that we are asked to do as the federal government in helping communities prepare for the impacts of climate change. In particular, we hear over and over again that people would like to have best available information. They want science, they want tools, they want services that are not just global in scale, but actually useful to folks who are trying to implement adaptation actions on the ground. They're also interested in having the government develop some transferable guidance and kind of climate smart policies, but they don't necessarily want to mandate, right? So there's this kind of, differences in opinions of how much guidance they want versus how much flexibility they want. They also would like the government to serve as a leader, particularly those communities that are very active and those states that are very active on climate change are looking to the government for leadership, and also to serve as a convener and to support partnerships across scales. So we at NOAA are experiencing a tremendous increase in the demand for climate information. This is a major part of our day job. We provide weather and climate information for the nation. And basically, so in the fiscal year 2012, we set a new record for total data downloaded by our customers from our National Climatic Data Center. And this is 1.91 petabytes, which I had to look up because that was just such a big number I couldn't even fathom. And if you translate it, I think it comes out to about 25 years of high-definition video played continuously without repeat. So that was just in 1 year alone. And this is a 40 times increase from just fiscal year 2005. So this increase reflects both the growing demand as well as our growing capacity to provide data to our users, and we're trying to meet this growing demand as rapidly as we can. We also have a climate portal called climate.gov, where we're trying to share climate information, particularly with the public and with educators and scientists and others. And our visit rates for this website, which has basically been in a prototype form, increased by 62% within the course of an individual year. So who is asking for our climate information? I had never seen these data until about the day before I had to turn in my talk. And lawyers are the #1 group that requests NOAA's climate information, which was fascinating to me. And so, it turns out that because we basically certify weather and climate information, it's used for all kinds of legal purposes. But as you can see, also insurance industries, engineers, businesses, individuals, scientists, et cetera, also rely on our climate information. And what do people want? What are they asking for? What type of information are they asking for as they're trying to prepare for the impacts of climate change? Well, they obviously want to know what's going to happen. They want to know how they're already vulnerable, and what are the projected impacts into the future. They want to know what's at risk, so how vulnerable their infrastructure might be, or their ecosystems if they're natural resource managers, or their homes. And they also want options for what they can do. They want actionable information and some ideas of ways that they might be able to enhance their resilience in the future. So we develop a whole bunch of tools and services. This is one that NOAA's Coastal Services Center puts out through the Digital Coast platform. It's our sea level rise viewer, and so basically this helps show people under different sea level rise scenarios where water is likely to be, basically. And then one cool little feature is that you can do a little snapshot of some of the areas of importance, so it could be your courthouse or whatever, to show where the water level would be, and we found that to be very effective, really showing in your backyard what would it look like under this. And that is much more, resonates much better than I was just telling someone at lunch, than a polar bear does, right? I mean, it is important too to connect people to the more global issues, but particularly when you're working with local communities, it helps to show what it's really gonna mean to them. NOAA manages fisheries, so we actually provide climate information internally to some of our fisheries managers. This isn't a NOAA product, but this just shows one of the impacts that's happening is basically shifts in species ranges. So the fish are following the warmer water temperatures, and this is just showing red hake and their northward movement within a 40-year time frame. And basically, under large-scale temperature and circulation changes, more shifts in species ranges are projected to occur. In this one study, they found that 24 of 36 stocks examined exhibited changes, and they moved either northward or deeper with cooler water temperatures. And basically, under these scenarios, there are going to be what we call winners and losers, the species that like the warm water temperature or that aren't particularly affected, versus those that have a relatively narrow tolerance range or prefer cooler temperatures. And also important to note that in the fisheries, there will be winners and losers, right? In this particular scenario, New Jersey, some of the other coastal states are losing the fish, whereas they're gaining them farther northward. So another major impact that we work a lot on is drought. So we have a program, the National Integrated Drought Information System, that hosts a whole bunch of different tools, including the drought portal, drought.gov. And this was a screenshot just from a couple weeks ago, showing the extent and severity of the drought, which is really pretty horrifying. You know, this area has been very, very, very dry for a really long time. There's another persistent patch in the southeast, and you might not think that drought matters to coasts, but it actually does. Having lived in the Panhandle and dealt with some of the downstream impacts of drought in Georgia, impacts to estuaries can be very severe with changes in freshwater input. So in another example of our growing demand, particularly during events, our number of website hits increases dramatically. So this website gets about 36,000 unique hits a month and reached up to 180,000 in August. So given all of that, and I'm approaching this as a scientist now working in the policy arena, so I'm going to talk primarily about some of our efforts to better connect science to users, but also some of our broader policy initiatives. And this is a list of just a few of the major national climate adaptation science and policy efforts. It's too hard in 30 minutes to cover everything. We've heard about some other efforts like changes to the National Flood Insurance Program. I'm sure we'll hear others throughout the next couple of days, but I'm gonna just quickly walk you through these. So the Interagency Climate Change Adaptation Task Force was created in 2009, and it was associated with an executive order that required all federal agencies to develop sustainability plans and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So there was a little paragraph in there that said, and by the way, adaptation is important, and there is going to be an Interagency Climate Change Adaptation Task Force that will develop recommendations for how the federal government can basically exhibit leadership on climate adaptation and enhance resilience of the nation. More than 20 federal agencies have been involved in this group over the past couple of years in the leadership of this effort. You have groups from Housing and Urban Development to Office of Management and Budget to the Department of the Interior, Department of Transportation. It's a very interdisciplinary effort. And basically, when the task force started, it created a set of work groups focused on different topical issues like water, science, which is a very broad one that I was involved in, what federal agencies can do, and other topics. And then developed a set of recommendations and guiding principles that were published in the 2010 task force report to the president, as well as a progress report on those actions to date in 2011. And one of the early outcomes of this effort, one reason that it's important, is that now all federal agencies are required to develop and implement climate adaptation plans, which probably most of you hadn't heard about. So this is actually huge if you think about it, the fact that every single federal agency, no matter what their kind of bailiwick is, has to develop an adaptation plan. And when you think about the amount of lands, waters, buildings, roads that are managed by the federal government, this could potentially be a really great opportunity to actually make some headway. Oh, and I should say that the first plans came in June 2012, and they will actually be made publicly available within the next couple of months, so keep your eyes out for that. One of the guiding principles that was included in the task force report was ecosystem-based adaptation, and we've heard about that a couple different ways today. Some people are saying living shorelines or green infrastructure, but basically acknowledging that natural systems can provide a lot of resilience to coastal communities, as well as other benefits like nursery habitat for fish, beautiful places to recreate, that may not be provided by hardened structures. And so basically all agencies are being asked to consider ecosystem-based adaptation where relevant to take into account strategies to increase ecosystem resilience and protect ecosystem services. So I think this is also a very exciting forward-looking perspective, and we held a workshop on ecosystem-based adaptation for the agencies developing plans and had over 100 attendees. It was really, really popular. Another effort that is underway is through the US Global Change Research Program. They've created a new program focused on adaptation science. And USGCRP has been around since 1990. It was created under the Global Change Research Act to enhance interagency coordination of the federal agencies that work on climate science and that fund climate science. So it's a $2.6 billion investment, and 13 agencies are involved. Historically, it's focused very much on advancing the state of knowledge, particularly at the global scale, as well as some work at the national scale. But now we're seeing a different set of information needs arise as folks are working to try to implement local adaptation actions. And they're sort of saying, yeah, this science is great, but it doesn't really help me understand what I need to do and where I'm vulnerable. So adaptation science actually began as the science work group under the Interagency Task Force and was subsequently subsumed within USGCRP to give it a programmatic home where it's associated with the different federal agencies that support climate science. And basically, this group is working on developing a research agenda focused on science in support of adaptation that the federal agencies can rally around. This is important because it shows an increased emphasis amongst the federal science agencies on science in support of societal decisions. And this is science including not just physical climate science, but social, behavioral, economic science, other types of science that are very much needed when you're trying to address adaptation issues. And you can see this major shift in the program through the new decadal strategic research plan that was recently released. Which has a major emphasis on improving the deployment and accessibility of science to inform adaptation decisions. So part of this is a translation issue. It's making sure that the government doesn't just deliver a bunch of technical reports and shelve them, but rather that they actually work to connect the science to decision makers, many of whom are not scientists, in ways that they can access and use it in ways that they find relevant. And then it's also laying out a whole new set of science for the new needs that are arising through adaptation. And these are just some of the kind of goals associated with that effort. Another major effort underway, which some of you may have been involved in, is the US National Climate Assessment. The climate assessment is actually conducted through USGCRP. It was required through the Global Change Research Act to be conducted every 4 years. The last one came out in 2009, so the next one is slated to come out in 2013, and I'll show you a timeline in a minute. But basically, the National Climate Assessment is a synthesis and assessment of current and anticipated climate impacts across the United States, across regions, and across sectors. And there are some sectors that are specified in the Global Change Research Act, but this particular national climate assessment is actually being designed to be broader and to take on additional sectors that are not required by law, but that we know are important. Like oceans, for example, has never been addressed in the National Climate Assessment before. There has been a focus on coasts, but not on oceans. And so this is a new emphasis for the 2013 report. There will also be new chapters like tribes, rural communities, and again, historically it was sort of just this is the state of the science, but now we're starting to see a demand from decision makers on the ground for, okay, that's the state of the science, what are my options, what are people doing about it? And so we also have an adaptation, a mitigation, and a decision support chapter. This assessment is being conducted with extensive engagement of scientists and stakeholders. I think they've had something like 75 workshops in the past couple of years and are going to have another 25 in the coming year. And these are being done both through professional scientific societies, meetings with the American Planning Association, others, a whole bunch of different groups depending on what the topic is that they're discussing, because they do want it to be useful. And they're also going to deploy this online so that it'll be user-friendly and have some interesting visualizations and be able to back up all the way to the data so that the scientists find it particularly useful. So trying to make it as flexible as possible. The draft assessment chapters will be released for public review either in December or January, so either next month or the following month. And this document serves as a highly influential status report on regional and sectoral climate impacts, vulnerabilities, and adaptation that hopefully will be useful for different groups who are working to adapt. One of the aspects of the assessment was to solicit technical inputs from the broad community, and they put out a Federal Register notice and got 534 different technical inputs, which is pretty amazing on all different topics associated with climate variability and change. And some of these even came from non-scientists, like we did actually have one come from a tribe in Louisiana that was facing the impacts of climate change. And then the author teams, I'm on the coastal author team, we reviewed all of the technical inputs that were flagged as relevant to us. So in our case, there were 79 different technical inputs that were flagged as coastal. And then basically read through all of them, selected some of the major findings, worked to compile that, as well as draw in additional information from peer-reviewed literature to come up with our synthesis and assessment. So this is basically our generic timeline. The technical inputs came in, the Federal Register notice was released, the author teams began working, technical inputs came in, then we met, magic happened, and then we submitted our draft chapters to the National Climate Assessment. So basically it goes through extensive interagency review, and then will be released for public comment very shortly, and then the final document will come out at the end of 2013. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the coastal chapter, just kind of our process and what we were considering. One thing we were supposed to look at is what are some of the major scientific advances since the last National Climate Assessment in 2009. And I'm not going to read these all off, but this is just a list of some of the fields where we felt like major advances had been made, such as with shoreline change predictive capability, valuation of ecosystem services, understanding public awareness of and barriers to adaptation actions. And so, trying to draw from some of these areas where there's emerging knowledge to kind of refresh the state of understanding. And then these were some of the key questions that we addressed. So we wanted to take an integrative approach. The last coastal chapter was very much focused on the kind of ecological impacts of a changing climate on coasts. So we wanted to take a more kind of infrastructure, economic, social vulnerability, ecological hybrid approach. And our team very much reflected that. Like I was the only ecologist, and then we had a social scientist, an economist, a decision maker, a physical scientist, and an infrastructure person. So we were looking at how will the critical infrastructure, which we called lifelines, in the immediate coastal zone be impacted by climate change? And that was, kind of an infrastructure question and associated with disruption in commerce, transportation, other issues. Then, will people experience the risks from climate change equally? And do they have equal opportunities or capacities to respond, which we've already heard a little bit about this morning in terms of, who really has the ability to respond or to retreat versus who doesn't. And how will climate change impact the coastal economic engine? Because as we know, coasts are a major part of the economy of the United States. And what do these disruptions mean, not just for the coastal zone, but the other regions of the US that depend on the coastal zone? Then how will natural systems be affected by climate change? And how will these changes impact the human systems that depend on them? And finally, what's the status of coastal adaptation efforts in the United States to date? And the answers to these questions will be forthcoming. So when the draft is released, you can check them out and you can comment on them. Another effort underway, which is probably the one that you're most familiar with, is the U.S. National Ocean Policy. So for the first time ever, we have a U.S. National Ocean Policy. And this was created by executive order in July 2010, came out after the oil spill, to enhance stewardship of U.S. coasts, oceans, and Great Lakes. Associated with the ocean policy are a set of 9 priority areas, and one of those is resiliency and adaptation to climate change and ocean acidification, which is one that I was involved in developing along with an interagency team. The implementation plan was released as a draft for public comment and has subsequently been revised and will be released any day now, is what I'm hearing. So one of the reasons this is important is that it enhances coordination and prioritization of science and policy across the more than 15 federal agencies that have responsibilities over coasts and oceans or that are users of coasts and oceans. These were the 6 actions that were outlined for the climate change and ocean acidification in the draft implementation plan. So they're basically, very general, and then associated with that were specific milestones with specific agencies listed that were charged with implementing them. But they include strengthening and integrating observations, better using sentinel sites in protected areas to understand the impacts of climate change and ocean acidification, the sort of research agenda determining the impacts of climate change on coastal and ocean, ecological, economic, physical, and social systems, providing critical projections at decision relevant scales, so how will oceans and coasts change in the future with climate change, assessing the vulnerability of coasts and oceans to climate change, developing information training, guidance, and tools, and designing, implementing, and actually evaluating adaptation strategies. And the final effort I'm going to mention is another national adaptation effort of relevance to coasts and oceans. This is the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy. It was requested in 2009 in the Department of the Interior Appropriations Conference Report, and it's being co-led by the Department of the Interior, NOAA, and actually the states. So this one is a little bit different than the others in that it truly is national as opposed to federal. It actually has state and tribal partners at the table and has from the very, very beginning. So it's a little more unique that way and hopefully a little bit more integrative. And the idea of the strategy is to basically identify a set of shared actions to reduce climate impacts on natural resources. The strategy is near completion and should also be released any day now. And it will provide a framework for enhancing cross-governmental coordination on ecosystem adaptation. So I think it's important to note, as we'll hear this afternoon, that there are many, many actions outside of the federal government, and that really all adaptation is local. So it certainly can't be done by the federal government alone, and it will very much be driven in large part by actions on the ground. So just some examples, the work that Philadelphia is doing to integrate green infrastructure into their stormwater management, the work that Chicago is doing to enhance their climate resilience, and the BCDC work in San Francisco, amending the Bay Plan to account for sea level rise. And we've already heard a bunch more, and we'll hear many, many more this afternoon. So I think we really are at a critical juncture where we're experiencing the impacts of climate change across the US, and those are going to continue and probably worsen in the future. And so the actions that are taken now in this critical window will determine the future resilience of our societies, our economies, and our ecosystems. And I think we've heard a lot of sad things today, and I know it's easy to kind of feel a sense of despair, but I also try really hard to find reasons for hope. And I think that, we certainly are seeing major advances in the state of understanding and also doing a better job of connecting science to people that need it. And we are really seeing tremendous momentum on climate adaptation. It was really inspiring to be on the National Climate Assessment Coastal Author Team and think about where, within the course of 4 years, where we've come as a country and how many adaptation efforts, you can't possibly know what they are because every day there are like 100 new ones popping up. So that's wonderful, but the question is, are those actions occurring quickly enough, and will they meet the scale of the challenges that we're facing? I also think that we can see positive societal tipping points occur. We've seen this with smoking, with drunk driving, and I think that we really are on the verge of a positive societal tipping point when it comes to climate change. And with that, I thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, we have a little bit of time for questions. We started just a bit late, but we will do our best to get some questions in. So we'll stand by if anybody from the webinar is going to submit a question. And Julia Wyman, our staff attorney, and myself will shuffle microphones to you. Just identify yourself so Dr. Pettish knows who she's talking to.
Thanks. Is this on? Yeah. I'm Austin Becker, and my question is, do you have a sense of which elected officials are particularly championing adaptation, if any?
I mean, I think I can speak, at least, right, we saw some with Sandy alone, right? I mean, I think that Bloomberg, Cuomo, others, I really do think that one of the reasons that New York was as prepared for Sandy as they were is because they've been preparing for climate change very actively and in close collaboration with scientists. And so, you know, they knew that the subway was going to flood. They knew where their low-lying areas were. And so it was a good example of how long-term planning can help inform short-term preparedness. I'm not going to speak so much about Congress, but, you know, I think there are certainly elected officials who are very supportive of adaptation and whose constituents are very concerned about the impacts of climate change.
Stand by. We have a webinar question coming in. A question from Marion Lindberg with the Nature Conservancy. What role do you feel environmental non-governmental organizations working on adaptation, that's easy for me to say, can best play locally and nationally? And we have a few nonprofit organizations in the room today.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many, many roles. I think in many ways, the reasons that we're even including ecosystem-based adaptation as a guiding principle in government reports is because of the work of environmental nonprofits to really champion the role of ecosystem services in enhancing resilience of communities. And I think that continued role of advancing the science and partnering with communities and infrastructure folks on innovative solutions that involve green infrastructure and ecosystem services is an extremely important role.
Question from this side. I'm trying to give folks fair play across the room and the webosphere.
Thank you. Given that NOAA manages fisheries, and also given the fact that your studies have documented that 24 of the 36 fish stocks, sure, 24 of the 36 fish stocks have been impacted by climate change to the effect that they have moved northward or deeper. Is there any effort to realign the species assignment for the consuls that are developing fish management plans, or the addition of other states in consul development of fish management plans?
Yeah, you know, I'm going to kind of punt on that question because it's a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but I can definitely connect you to someone in NOAA Fisheries who would probably know the answer to that. I do know that they are certainly trying to conduct vulnerability assessments of, you know, I mean, even the fundamental understanding of the impacts of climate change on fish are still not totally well understood, and so I know that they're working very hard to advance the state of knowledge. I'm not sure how far that's translated into actual policy and management to date, but I can find out.
Well, we've known it for a while up here in Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Scup and black sea bass are not within our purview.
Yeah.
In another consul's purview, but we are impacted by those consul determinations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there is some more forward-looking work, like in the Bering Sea, they actually knew the relationship between climate and recruitment for pollock, and they actually set the limit, you know, lower one year because they knew recruitment was going to be bad because of climate conditions. So that was a bit more of an adaptive management cycle that I wouldn't be surprised if other fisheries start adopting as well.
Okay, can you provide that information? Shall I do that offline? Or?
Yep.
Okay, very good, thank you.
And we're going to actually have a panel tomorrow that's going to focus specifically on impacts of resources, and a scientist from the Narragansett Bay Lab is going to talk about some of the winners and losers projections, so, and some ecosystem governance approaches. So it's all coming together. I love it. We'll go to that side of the room.
Hi, Regina Lyons, EPA Region 1, and I'm actually doing a remote detail with CEQ. So I feel the need to just mention that there's also one more national strategy, and that's actually the national strategy on managing freshwater resources in a changing climate. And we're actually in the implementation phase. We're going on our 2013 work plan, and we're really excited for the National Ocean Policy and the Fish, Wildlife, and Plant strategy to be coming out and seeing how that the freshwater resources can also connect with, there's clearly some coastal and ocean components to that as well. So I'd just say that there's kind of 3 different national strategies, and they're all looking to work together and see how we can get into the implementation phases of these strategies.
Thank you for mentioning that. And there actually is a group focused on coordinating across those national strategies with everything from outreach material to actually implementation.
We're going to take just one last question because we've got a full agenda to get through this afternoon. So this is from a webinar participant, Clark Alexander from the Skidaway Institute of Oceanography. How and where is NOAA implementing the Sentinel Site monitoring strategy?
Okay, I'll try to remember. There are 5 pilot areas. Basically, NOAA is working primarily through the National Ocean Service to do a better job of leveraging its own stewardship responsibilities, scientific monitoring, particularly on ecosystems, so like with the National Marine Sanctuaries and the National Estuarine Research Reserves and our adjacent partners. There are 5 Sentinel Site cooperatives that have been stood up. I know there's one in Hawaii, one in the Chesapeake, one in North Carolina. I think there's one in San Francisco, and I think there's one in the Northern Gulf. So those are just some regions where we already have a lot of assets to bear, and we're going to try to do a better job of coordinating across our data sets, making sure that we can get that information out to others, and using those pilots as a way to sort of scale that up nationally in the future.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Pettish.